You know, before I got here, I was given an instruction to be careful about how I put the terms of my talk, lest people in the audience be scandalized, don't come on too strong. And after Father Isaac's talk, I don't think that's very And Father Isaac reminded me of the continuing legal education seminars I have to go to as a lawyer. And the purpose of these seminars is to tell you that if you don't do all of these things on this list, you are in serious trouble as a lawyer. Well, in Father's case, he's telling us about all the things we have to do in order to save our souls, and that was a pretty sobering lecture. And my stuff is going to be rather plain vanilla. But I think what I'm going to do is probably develop in more detail some of the points he made about the controversy surrounding this, shall we say, most unusual pontificate. And the theme of my talk will emphasize the necessity not only of we, members of the laity, to stand up for the truth that makes us free, but above all, the members of the hierarchy. Where are they? That's the theme of this talk, after I identify the problem it is that they should be addressing. And I guess the best way to begin this talk is with a quote from the liturgical year by Dom Prosper Guéranger. And I quote, "When the shepherd becomes a wolf, the first duty of the flock is to defend itself. The true children of Holy Church at such times are those who walk by the light of their baptism, not the cowardly souls who, under the specious pretext of submission to the powers that be, delay their opposition to the enemy in the hope of receiving instructions which are neither necessary nor desirable." In other words, they timidly wait to be told what to do when they know very well what they have to do. Another thing that strikes me about this pontificate, with its unprecedented disturbances of the church, is the fact how even those who, for want of a better word, conspired to bring about the election of Pope Francis are now experiencing something like buyer's remorse. And I'm thinking in particular of a quote reliably attributed to Cardinal Leonardo Sandri, heard behind closed doors. He screamed at the Roman pontiff, "We elected you to make reforms, not to smash everything." And this was reliably reported to have happened within the walls of the Vatican itself. And he's one of a number of Bergoglian partisans that are realizing we have with this pontificate something the likes of which the Church has never seen before. Something that not only exceeds their wildest dreams, but has become, even for them, a nightmare. Now we have the mainstream of the Church waking up to this situation. And this is a good thing. We're in the midst of a great awakening among the broad mainstream of Catholic commentary, pretty much confined to the laity and a few good priests. And so, for example, we have a book written by a member of the mainstream. I know who he is, but I'm not telling you. The Dictator Pope. And of this book, another mainstream commentator, Robert Royal, signaling the alarm that is spreading among the Catholic mainstream, has written, quote, "About 90% of it is simply incontrovertible and cannot help but clarify who Francis is and what he is about." This is the peculiar thing that's going on when I speak of this great awakening, that people are actually looking at the mentality of a particular pope and seeing there something that is truly frightening. A psychological study is underway on the part of members of the laity who are writing books like this. And the picture that emerges, the psychological portrait presented in The Dictator Pope, written by a layman, as LifeSite News reports, is that of a, quote, "power-hungry, manipulative dictator who, quote, celebrated the abdication of Benedict XVI, end quote, because he knew what it meant, that the plan by which he was to be installed as the Roman pontiff in 2005 would finally come to fruition after the Pope's mysterious resignation in 2013. Now, Francis, says Robert Royal, and you can't ask for a more mainstream figure than Robert Royal, a commentator for EWTN, has little use for established procedures, precedents, even local legal structures within the Church. When the head of the Church himself does not much feel bound by the tradition or impartial laws he has inherited, what then? What then? Well, what then is answered by another lay writer who has written a book, and I'm talking about Philip Lawler. If anything, he's even more mainstream, more cautious in what he has to say than the anonymous author of this book. And I'm hearing commentary from the mainstream, oh, well, you know, unlike those Fatimites and the traditionalists, this particular author, Mr. Lawler, he's very sober and restrained in his analysis, not like those crazy traditionalists, not like those Fatimites that follow Father Gruner and carry on his legacy. No, he's very, very, very staid and sober and patient in his analysis. And so he wrote a book called Lost Shepherd. How Pope Francis is Misleading His Flock is the subtitle. Very sober, wouldn't you say? And I'm not saying that to make fun of Mr. Lawler. I'm saying it to point out that now it is obvious to everyone that we are dealing with something that is nothing less than apocalyptic in the emergence of this particular pontificate. And within this pontificate, we are witness to the single worst act of tyranny in the entire history of the papacy. What am I talking about? Well, the Church has seen a number of popes who abuse their authority, shamefully in many cases, and yet the Church has survived all of these pontificates. Alexander VI is the most popularly known example. But never, absolutely never before this pontificate has there been a pope who dared to tyrannize the magisterium itself by attempting to bend it to his errant personal opinions. And I'm talking in particular about the publication, this audacious act of publishing in the Acta Apostolicae Sedis, the AAS, an official declaration that it is authentic magisterium, according to Francis, what the bishops of Buenos Aires have provided as their guidelines for the implementation of Amoris Laetitia. The guidelines he had already approved in a private letter to them as the only correct interpretation of his will. Well, those guidelines have now been published in the AAS, along with Francis's private letter, which is suddenly declared to be an apostolic epistle, which is of a higher authority than an apostolic letter, as the phrase is commonly mistranslated from the Latin. An apostolic epistle is right up there with an encyclical, maybe even of a higher level of authority than an encyclical. So he is attempting to import the authority of the magisterium to a private letter expressing an utterly novel opinion. Now, in Italy, they have a phrase called normalists. They say that there's a brigade of people who are normalists. They want to keep telling us that everything is normal. They look for ways to contrive explanations about these developments in this turbulent pontificate, telling us that if you look at it in the lens of tradition, if you just interpret it this way and that way, bend it and twist it this way and that way, everything is still normal. It's still normal. Well, the normalist narrative has been destroyed by this one act, by the attempt to publish in the AAS as authentic magisterium the guidelines for the implementation of Amoris Laetitia by the bishops of Buenos Aires. And this is what these guidelines say. And I'm going to develop this point extensively to show you what we're really dealing with here. The guidelines say, and I'm quoting from the guidelines that Francis has approved, quote, when the concrete circumstances of a couple make it feasible, especially when both are Christians with a journey of faith, one may propose that they commit to living in continence. In other more complex circumstances, and when it is not possible to obtain a declaration of nullity, the aforementioned option may not in fact be viable. Nonetheless, it is equally possible to undertake a journey of discernment. If one arrives at the recognition that in a concrete case, there are limitations that diminish responsibility and culpability, citing Amoris Laetitia, paragraphs 301 to 302, particularly when a person judges that he would fall into subsequent fault by damaging the children of the new union, meaning the civil marriage following a divorce from one to whom one is validly married, Amoris Laetitia opens up the possibility of access to the sacraments of reconciliation and the Eucharist, citing Amoris Laetitia paragraph 336 and footnote 351. So as Francis would have it, the authentic magisterium has just flatly contradicted itself for the first time in 2,000 millennia. First of all, the admission of public adulterers in second marriages to Holy Communion. is now presented to us as a teaching of the authentic magisterium. But John Paul II, in line with all of tradition, called this intrinsically impossible. It cannot happen, given the objective state of life that people who divorce their true spouses and purport to remarry civilly find themselves in. The Catechism of John Paul calls this a condition of permanent and public adultery. It's impossible, literally impossible, for them to be admitted to Holy Communion while they persist in that state. Now, the requirement that John Paul II insisted upon in Familiaris Consortio, paragraph 84, that people embroiled in these unions, as they're now called, who find that they have children, they have a roof that has to be maintained for the sake of the children, and it could cause severe consequences if the union were broken up and the children were parceled off to one parent or the other, can, under these conditions, practice continence and live as brother and sister. They have to cease the adulterous sexual relationships. Of course, they really should end the relationship if at all possible. But in cases where it's not possible, they have to end those aspects of the relationship that pertain to the conjugal union. They cannot engage any longer in adulterous sexual relations, and they cannot be absolved unless they commit to doing precisely that, as, by the way, certain married saints have done. They have agreed to live as brother and sister. Now, this is a moral norm, said John Paul II, in a declaration of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, that is binding in conscience without exception. No exceptions, because of the intrinsic impossibility of what is being proposed. And yet now we find that this moral norm, to which there are no exceptions, is reduced to a proposal that may not be feasible or viable. When you apply feasibility or viability to exceptionless moral norms, you've undermined the entire moral order. The other point I want to draw out is this idea that there could be situations in which people are convinced in conscience that their first marriage in the church is invalid, but they cannot obtain proof of annulment. And this is what the bishops of Buenos Aires refer to as more complex circumstances, when it is not possible to obtain a declaration of nullity. Those people can, in these mysterious cases, be admitted to the sacraments while they continue to engage in sexual relations outside of marriage. Such cases do not exist. There is no case in which a couple is convinced in conscience that the first marriage is invalid, but there is no proof of nullity. They would have to have grounds for believing that the marriage was invalid, and if they have grounds, then proof would be available. This claim is nonsensical. Let us assume, for example, that there was a lack of intention to be bound by one party or the other. Why would proofs not be available? If someone, for example, married only to please his parents and had a mental reservation that he would seek a divorce if it didn't work out, that person would be able to testify to that. Or perhaps he was heard admitting that, and there could be testimony in a canonical proceeding. And that is why John Paul II insisted there is no possibility of a de facto annulment based on someone's claim that in conscience he's just absolutely sure his first marriage is invalid. This must be determined in the external forum, and only there. This case of someone who is convinced his first marriage is invalid but can't obtain proofs sufficient for a declaration of nullity is mythical. It doesn't exist. It's been invented for the purpose of undermining an exceptionless moral norm. The next thing about this notion that these guidelines are authentic magisterium, this phrase, journey of discernment. What in heaven's name does that mean? I'll tell you what it means. Father Harrison said it best, and I can only repeat his explanation. The journey of discernment means that you discern while receiving Holy Communion in a state of adultery that you should not be receiving Holy Communion while in a state of adultery. And having discerned this, apparently you go on receiving Holy Communion in a state of adultery. It is incredible that such nonsense, such insulting rubbish would be presented to us as a teaching of the authentic magisterium. That is why I'm talking about an apocalyptic development in the church. It's just ridiculous. It's a joke. And yet the label authentic magisterium has been applied to it. Now, another point is that no less than a Roman pontiff has lent his name to the outrageous claim that children resulting from an adulterous relationship, now blithely described as the new union, would be damaged if the partners in adultery were required to cease their adultery in order to be absolved and receive Holy Communion. Why? Well, evidently, if one party to this new union says, you know, we need to live as brother and sister, we're living in a state of adultery, it has to stop. I can't engage in relations with you. If one party says this, the other party will walk out and abandon the spouse of the new union, and this will damage the children. So for the sake of the children, they're entitled to go on having their sexual relationship. They need to have that, you see, and you can't deprive them of that, because if one party walks out because he's not getting what he thinks he's entitled to, the children will be damaged. Is this a moral teaching? This is a justification for the continued habitation of two people in a state of adultery, engaging sexual relations outside of marriage. And we're told that they have to commit this sin to avoid committing another sin, which would be damaging the children. When has the church ever taught that you can commit one sin to avoid committing another sin? That's the end of all morality. It's the end justifies the means. And we're told this is authentic magisterium. Now, what has happened here? The contrary teaching of John Paul II, Benedict XVI, the Code of Canon Law, the Catechism of the Catholic Church, and the entire magisterium before that of 2,000 years are all purportedly abrogated, or at least abrogated, diminished in importance, or given exceptions, by the mere will of Francis. Nothing else. So let it be written, so let it be done. That's the explanation we're given. And yet he cunningly, I have to use that word, and I don't think I'm going too far after the talk we just heard, cunningly applies the label authentic magisterium to his personal novelties in a sham exercise. That's what it is. A sham exercise of the church's teaching authority for the obvious purpose, and this is the purpose behind this, because so many people were objecting to Amoris Laetitia. The purpose is to silence all opposition to what is really an intolerable abuse of the Petrine office. As recently as 17 years ago, during the reign of John Paul II, who, by the way, is looking pretty great right now, the Pontifical Council for the Interpretation of Legislative Texts reaffirmed the immutable truth about this moral norm that I'm talking about today, as reflected in Canon 915. Canon 915 of the Code of Canon Law, which reflects nothing more than the natural law, the divine law concerning morality, prohibits the administration of Holy Communion to those who obstinately persist in manifest grave sin. And that prohibition, said the Pontifical Council, applies specifically to the divorced and remarried who purport to remarry in a civil ceremony, and it applies not as a matter of mere disciplinary law, which could be changed, but rather, and I'm quoting, is derived from divine law and transcends the domain of positive ecclesiastical laws. And the latter cannot, meaning positive ecclesiastical laws, the latter cannot introduce legislative changes which would oppose the doctrine of the church, period. End quote, full stop, end of paragraph. The Pope cannot do what he is purporting to do, because the norm that we are talking about is rooted in divine law and goes beyond even positive ecclesiastical laws, which cannot be changed lightly because of the potential disturbing effects upon the life of the ecclesial commonwealth. It goes even beyond those to the status of an unchangeable, immutable moral norm rooted in divine law. And Francis, nonetheless, has purported to do nothing less than that, to change a moral norm that cannot be changed because it is rooted in divine law. And Father Isaac told us what our appropriate reaction is to this development. Get behind me, Satan. I'm not saying the Pope is a devil, but certainly someone is speaking through him, and it is not the magisterium of the Holy Catholic Church. It is a different spirit. Now, people know that I was joined to the hip to Father Gruner for many, many years. I owe that man so much. I can't even talk about him without breaking down. But I remember all the conversations we had at his kitchen table, in his house, his humble little house, with floors that are like this, by the way. And we would sit at the kitchen table, we would talk to 2, 3, 4 in the morning sometimes about various issues. And one point he always hammered on is that you cannot say that a teaching which contradicts the magisterium is authentic magisterium. By the way, the concept of the authentic magisterium, as opposed to simply the magisterium, was introduced in Lumen Gentium, the Vatican II document. And this causes confusion now. There's magisterium, there's authentic magisterium. There's only one magisterium. Magisterium is the teaching office of the church. And the teaching office of the church cannot teach a lie. What the church has always taught, it has taught infallibly because it has always and everywhere been believed. When the church defines a dogma, she first makes sure that what she is defining as a dogma is what has always and everywhere been taught as part of the authentic ordinary magisterium. So therefore, if a teaching contradicts what the church has always taught, Father Gruner told me again and again, it cannot be authentic magisterium, no matter what label you apply to it. It cannot be authentic magisterium even if you say, this is authentic magisterium. The phrase authentic magisterium is not a registered trademark. It's not a brand that you can apply to any statement you utter to give it the authority of the magisterium. Now, when Father Gruner said this, many people mocked him for it, like so many other things he said that are proven to be true, especially about the third secret and other matters related to Fatima. But now what do we find? But Father Thomas Weinandi has recently written an article. He was nothing less than the secretary of the Doctrinal Commission of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, and at this very moment, he sits on the International Theological Commission, appointed there by Pope Francis, who gave him the highest pontifical honor that one can bestow, the Pro Pontifico. I forget the exact name of the medal it was awarded. It was the highest honor you can bestow on someone for his service to the papacy and the church. And Father Thomas Weinandi has just written an article in which he says precisely that Memoris Laetitia, no matter what you call it, is not magisterial because the magisterium cannot contradict itself. It is that simple. Now, the attempt to change church teaching on marriage because it contradicts the prior magisterium is void. It's simply void. It binds no one. But the consequences of toying with the teaching office of the church to advance these half-baked theological notions, such as the journey of discernment, which, by the way, abuses St. Ignatius of Loyola in his discussion of the discernment of spirits, which Francis's novelty has nothing to do with. This has had catastrophic results. What it means essentially is the adoption or the attempt to adopt situation ethics in the Catholic Church. But this is very curious. Situation ethics, which Francis apparently intends to confine to the area of the sixth commandment, and only the sixth commandment. He will not absolve you due to complex circumstances from your failure to recycle. He will not absolve you from being a greedy capitalist. He will not absolve you from stealing or murder or other grave sins. Only the sixth commandment gets this special treatment of an exemption under complex circumstances. By the way, whose life isn't complex? How exactly does this journey of discernment work in practice? Just imagine this. Some guy named Frank comes into the confessional and he says, you know, Father, I have these complex circumstances. I remarried, you know, and I realized I shouldn't have done that. I abandoned my wife, I ran off with my secretary, but now he's 15 years later. We have 3 kids. What am I going to do, Father? I really want to receive Holy Communion, but here I am in this relationship, and I can't tell my wife we're not going to have relations anymore. She'll walk out on me, like the way I walked out on my wife. What am I going to do, Father? What am I going to do? And then the priest in the confessional says, you know, these are complex circumstances. You need to make a journey of discernment. So I'm going to admit you to Holy Communion while you journey toward your discernment. So you can go out there right now and you can receive Holy Communion. So Frank goes out there, okay? And he's sitting in the pews during Mass. And then Joe comes into the confessional. Joe has just run off with his secretary. It's only been about a year or two. They haven't had any children. And, you know, he really could just break it off and go back to his wife, who's still waiting for him with their 3 kids. And the priest says, you know, Joe, I'm sorry, but you're really not making the case to me about these complex circumstances. I know you really love this woman you've taken up with, and it would cause severe dislocation in her life if you left her, but you know, it's just not enough. I mean, you really need to journey and discern a little bit more. I'm sorry, I can't grant you absolution. So then Joe says, oh, well, I don't understand this. This is the age of Amoris Laetitia. He goes out and he sits down in the pew and he sees Frank go up to the communion rail. Now he knows Frank is divorced and remarried, and he says to himself, how does Frank get a pass to receive Holy Communion and I don't? So what we see is nothing less than a catastrophe in the moral life of the church, which is being passed off to us under the guise of Ignatian discernment, which is an utter mockery of what St. Ignatius was talking about. He was talking about discerning the spirits as to whether you should take a particular course in life, not as to whether you should continue committing a sin. His teaching has nothing to do with this nonsense. So now we talk about the hierarchy. Over the past year, Cardinal Burke and a few other members of the hierarchy have called upon Francis to clarify his intention respecting Amoris Laetitia. We've heard these constant requests for clarification, even after Pope Francis says that his teaching is the authentic magisterium and the bishops of Buenos Aires have it right. That's the only correct interpretation. What is left to be clarified at this point? Nothing. It's perfectly clear what Francis is attempting to do. And this is what Phil Lawler said in his column. Phil Lawler, Mr. Mainstream, in his column entitled, "This Disastrous Papacy." He said that he tried to convince himself that everything was normal, but now he realizes that Francis is attempting to change the teaching of the church. When somebody like Phil Lawler says this, we would be remiss not to say that and much more about what we have to do in this situation. So even if this attempt to change the teaching of the church is void and has no real effect before man or God, because an immoral law is no law at all, Francis clearly does mean to impose his will by fiat, daring to invoke the authentic magisterium to cloak absurd novelties. No pope before him has ever dared to do such a thing. So now I have to ask, where are the cardinals and the bishops? Where are they? With one or two noble, however inconsistent, I have to say, exceptions, the response to what I have to call the Bergoglian debacle thus far ranges from silence to active complicity to, at best, hand-wringing over an increasingly chaotic situation, while continuing to beg the Pope to clarify what he has already made perfectly clear. Now, the question of obedience comes into play. Well, after all, you may think that this is a problem, this new teaching of Francis, but don't you have to obey? He is, after all, the supreme authority in the church. To which I reply with a question. Obedience to what? There is nothing to obey, because an attempt to change church teaching has no force and effect. It's void before God, obviously. It's void before man. There is a contradiction of the faith that must be opposed by those whose duty it is to defend the faith. Another example from my conversations with Father Gruner. He always talked about and wrote about, more times than I can remember, the historical example of Bishop Robert Grosseteste, an English prelate who lived from 1175 to 1253. He reigned as bishop during the 13th, the greatest of centuries. This medieval English prelate stood up to numerous abuses of power committed by or on behalf of Pope Innocent IV, including Innocent's demand, and Father Gruner always focused on this example, that his youthful and utterly incompetent nephew be made a bishop just because it pleased the Pope that he be a bishop. And Bishop Grosseteste refused. He said, nothing doing. I'm not naming this incompetent a bishop. He'll destroy the diocese. Now that was a minor affair compared to the attack now underway on the moral order itself from the very vertices of the church. But Grosseteste's principled resistance is illustrative of the just limits of papal power. The Catholic Encyclopedia says this about Bishop Grosseteste, that he, quote, never denied the Pope's authority as the vicar of Christ and head of the church. What he did maintain was that the power of the Holy See was for edification, not for destruction. That the commands of the Pope could never transgress the limits laid down by the law of God, and that it was his duty as a bishop not to resist an order that was for the manifest destruction of the church. In such a case, out of filial reverence and obedience, said the bishop, I disobey, resist, and rebel. Not a rebellion in the satanic sense, but a rebellion of a descendant or a successor of the apostles who is rebelling against someone who in turn is attempting to harm the church. That kind of rebellion can be justified. We are dealing, as I say in this book that I wrote quite a while ago with my co-author, The Great Facade, with the appearance of a command. But let us assume that there is a command. Obedience to a command does not trump the truth of Christ. We are not the members of a Gnostic sect whose belief is governed by the latest pronouncements of something like the Oracle of Rome. We can know our faith. There is an obedience of faith as well as an obedience to authority. And it is possible for someone in authority to depart from the faith in his teaching or commands. And it is possible for us to know that he has done so. And in that case, the obedience of faith must be higher than obedience to authority. Otherwise, it would be the case that faith is of a lower order than obedience, and that would mean that God is lower than human authority. Therefore, not all the commands of ecclesiastical superiors are God's commands, and some commands may be positively contrary to God's will. And as always, St. Thomas Aquinas provides us with clarity on this point. In the Summa Theologica, he addresses the objection about people who live in religious orders, that just as religious in making their profession take vows of chastity and poverty, so do they also vow obedience. Now, a religious is bound to observe chastity and poverty in all things. Therefore, he is also bound to obey in all things. Not so, said St. Thomas, for not even a religious is bound to obey in all things. First of all, the head of the order must act within the scope of his authority. If he exceeds the scope of his authority, for example, by trying to change the order into something that it isn't, you don't have to obey him. He cannot destroy the order. So on the contrary, says St. Thomas, it is written, we ought to obey God rather than men. Now, sometimes the things commanded by a superior are against God. Therefore, superiors are not to be obeyed in all things. And if that is true even of an avowed religious, it is true of the laity and secular clergy, and above all, of bishops and cardinals. And it is true even as to the Bishop of Rome. We know this from common sense, but we know this also because a rather recent pope said so himself. And I'm talking, of course, about Benedict XVI's first homily as pope. And here is what he said. It could not apply more aptly to our situation. It was almost prophetic. Maybe he saw this thing coming. He said, the Pope is not an absolute monarch whose thoughts and desires are law. On the contrary, the Pope's ministry is a guarantee of obedience to Christ and to his word. He must not proclaim his own ideas, but rather constantly bind himself and the church to obedience to God's word in the face of every attempt to adapt it or water it down and every form of opportunism. Pope John Paul II did this, Benedict continued, when, in front of all attempts apparently benevolent to the human person, and in the face of erroneous interpretations of freedom, he unequivocally stressed the inviolability of the human being and of human life from the moment of conception until natural death. The freedom to kill is not true freedom, but a tyranny that reduces the human being to slavery, end quote. But John Paul II also did this against all opposition, because this issue about the divorced and remarried was percolating throughout his pontificate. He also did this as to the indissolubility of marriage by insisting upon the invariant, exceptionless moral norm that makes it intrinsically possible for people living in adultery with no commitment to cease their adultery to receive Holy Communion. He did that in spite of all the efforts to get him to compromise on that teaching, to water it down in response to opportunism. Now, Sister Lucia, speaking in light of the Message of Fatima, we all know this quote, warned Cardinal Ferrara, one of the opponents of Amoris Laetitia's novelties, who is now no longer with us, Father, back then he was Father Ferrara, founding the John Paul II Institute for the study of marriage and family, which, by the way, Francis has abolished. Father, a time will come when the decisive battle between the kingdom of Christ and Satan will be over marriage and the family. And those who will work for the good of the family will experience persecution and tribulation, but do not be afraid, because Our Lady has already crushed his head. Now, in conclusion, let me say this about continued inaction by the cardinals and bishops. We members of the laity and a few good priests have been left to ourselves, essentially, to defend as best we can the constant teaching of the Church against the abuses of, I'll quote the title of the book, a dictator pope. That's what's going on. I'm sorry, but that's the truth. On the chair of Peter, who threatens the hierarchs with a legacy of shame and terrible accountability if they do not stand up to him. Now, right now, their failure to defend the faith by standing up to the one they know full well is attacking it almost daily. And by the way, now we're looking at changes on the teaching of contraception, aren't we? And we're hearing talk about married priests and lady deacons. No one is standing up to stop this steamroller. Their failure to defend the faith by standing up to the one they know is attacking it almost daily lends itself ever more to an indictment for timidity in the face of unprecedented danger to the Church and the cause of the gospel, of which they are divinely charged to be the leaders. And I say the time for prudence is long past. Prudence is now giving way to just simple timidity, especially when we see that mere laymen of the Catholic mainstream, are saying things like, we have a dictator on the chair of Peter, we have a lost shepherd who was misleading his flock. People who would never have considered saying these things about any pope only a few years ago are now compelled by their conscience, by the reality confronting all of us, to say them now, and yet the hierarchs remain silent. They won't say it. The time for their action, the bishops and the princes of the Church, is now, before the damage to the Church becomes irreparable. They have to rise to the challenge that Monsignor Klaus Gamber issued many years ago, back in the 1980s, when the ecclesial crisis was already monumental, but now we can see it was only in a preliminary stage. Here is what he said in his book, The Reform of the Roman Liturgy, to which the future Pope Benedict XVI wrote the French language preface. He said, and I quote, "Where in our Church are the leaders who can show us the right path? Where are the bishops courageous enough to cut out the cancerous growth of modernist theology that has implanted itself and is festering within the celebration of even the most sacred mysteries before the cancer spreads and causes even greater damage? What we need today," he said, "is a new Athanasius, a new Basil, bishops like those who in the 4th century fought courageously against Arianism when almost the whole of Christendom succumbed to heresy." This has happened before, and the Church survived. The Church will survive this. But God has to act through his human instruments, unless, of course, we get the asteroid as a divine solution. If they don't wake up, that's what's going to happen. We know from salvation history that when the Church doesn't right itself, God does the job for us by rebooting an entire civilization, as happened during the fall of Rome, after Rome had already become a Christian commonwealth. It fell within 50 years. And St. Augustine, in his monumental work, had to explain why this happened. It wasn't Christianity, he said. Nevertheless, it happened within 50 years. The entire civilization collapsed and had to be rebuilt. It took centuries to do that. So I ask, will none of the hierarchs rise to defend the Church as a new Athanasius and a new Basil? Even the best among them continue to limit themselves to generalized lamentations at conferences or in interviews about the state of the Church, or at most the confusion Francis has caused by not clarifying exactly what he has made clear beyond all reasonable doubt. They avoid the absolutely necessary, direct and public exposure of error at its source, just as Paul withstood Peter to his face, to allude to Father Isaac's talk. That error threatens to overwhelm the Church right now, in this moment in history, while they do little more than fret about a situation whose self-evident cause, and I have to say this as harsh as it is, whose self-evident cause, a reckless pontiff in love with his own ideas and filled with contempt for tradition, they seem incapable of identifying, even though they know that that's the source. Concerned clergy and laity throughout the Catholic world are doing what they can. We're all doing what we can according to our stations. But in the midst of this final battle over marriage and family, of which Sister Lucia warned Cardinal Ferrara, in light, by the way, of the third secret of Fatima, that's obvious. Within the human element of the church, still only the cardinals and the bishops have the divinely bestowed power to repel an assault on marriage, family, and the very integrity of the faith that now, for the first time in church history, going even beyond the Arian crisis, is being led by a Roman pontiff and his collaborators. This undeniably apocalyptic development imposes upon the hierarchs, first and foremost in the church, the duty to act. True love for the church and true charity for Francis himself requires of them nothing less than what was required of St. Paul when he stood up to St. Peter, that the Pope be withstood to his face by those who have the power to do so effectively, not by us. We're nothing. All we can do is gird ourselves for what's going on and buck each other up at conferences like this. But we are not the ones to withstand the Pope to his face. We would have the right to do so. Every member of the baptized faithful has the right to do so. But to be effective, to exercise the authority of the church truly effectively, to oppose a wayward Roman pontiff, only the hierarchs can do that. And the theological writers, including St. Robert Bellarmine, have talked about ways in which this could be accomplished if, God forbid, we would encounter a pope who is spreading heresy. It would involve the cardinals, basically, censuring the pope and telling him to recant of his errors. We see nothing like that. It has to be done. My last words. Part of being a Catholic is to recognize the signs of the times, as Vatican II said, and to act accordingly. Ironically enough, since Vatican II, churchmen have been ignoring the signs of the times. Sometimes obedience to authority would destroy the obedience of faith. And when obedience destroys obedience, how can the hierarchy obey? When obedience is opposed to the faith, how can the successors of the apostles and the princes of the church do anything but refuse obedience and resist what is commanded? If it were otherwise, our faith would have no meaning, and the church would be a merely human institution governed by an autocrat whose will is law. Exactly the thing Benedict said at the start of his pontificate, the Pope is not. As Benedict almost prophetically reminded us at the beginning of his mysteriously terminated pontificate, the church of the autocrat whose will is law is not the church that Christ founded. It is the church he founded, not a particular pope, that the members of the hierarchy must now defend. Our Lady of Fatima, pray for us.